You know, in ways that probably weren't totally clear to me at the time. I did do some journalism as an undergrad. I did one semester of reporting for the Crimson, but all on sports, which was not what I ended up covering when I actually worked in journalism after graduation. But what Harvard did for me that really served me well in journalism is it opened my eyes to a wider world than I had been focused on when I first got here. When I arrived at Harvard, I was very interested in domestic politics. I thought I would maybe want to go to Washington and work in government, or even go back to Vermont, where I was from, and work in government there. But I was not very interested in international affairs. Through some classes that I took, some professors that I got to know, I really did get interested in the world outside the United States, and then spent the next 15, maybe now almost 20 years of my life very focused on international affairs, starting as a journalist in Asia and then in the Middle East. One of the nice things about being a foreign correspondent is because of time zones and because of how these organizations are structured, you really get to choose and determine your day entirely on your own. Often you wake up in the morning and it is the middle of the night for your bosses or for your editors, so most of your day you have to go through and make decisions without checking in with anyone back in your home office. That's one of the things that people tend to like, a high degree of autonomy and choosing your own adventure. And then the job itself really is great because you are paid to essentially find the most interesting stories that you can, be a witness to events, and then if you like writing, tell those stories to an audience back in the United States that would have no other way to really have access to that information. I did this job, as I said, in Asia, also in the Middle East. Most of my reporting ended up being focused on conflicts, the Iraq War, on two wars related to Israel, with Lebanon in 2006, so Hezbollah, with Hamas in Gaza in 2009, and then the Russia-Georgia War in 2008. Conflict reporting is a particular challenge. It can be exciting. It can also be traumatizing because of some of the things that you see and are compelled to write about. So a very broad set of experiences that I feel very lucky to have had. Yeah, I think the thing that I will always remember most about being a journalist was the invasion of Iraq, and I'll remember it for a number of reasons. One, it was my first real assignment as a newspaper reporter. I had been at the Washington Post for just a few months when my editors asked if I wanted to go to Kuwait and prepare to go into Iraq with the military through this new program, new at the time, called the Embedded Media Program, which meant journalists accompanying military units as they invaded Iraq. We hadn't had that sort of access. News organizations hadn't had that sort of access really since the Vietnam War. So it was a big opportunity. And because the news organizations weren't so sure whether the military was going to allow reporters to see the most important events, they tended to send less experienced people like me and keep their more experienced people for covering the war in more conventional ways. It was a great opportunity because in the end the military did give a high degree of access to everything that their troops were doing. I went in to Iraq with Marine infantry units, so riding in the back of an armored vehicle with 16 or 17 Marine enlisted Marines who were about my age, maybe a few years younger in most cases. Coincidentally, another reporter in that same vehicle, in that same unit, was a Chicago Tribune reporter named Evan Osnos, who was my college roommate here at Harvard. So in the category of a very small world. It was an amazing experience because it felt like a big historic event to be able to be a witness to and be a part of. It was also a great experience because I'd never really spent time around the military before. So I got to learn about that culture, about how incredibly dedicated and committed they were to doing their jobs at an extremely trying and nerve-wracking time for me, for them, for all of us, for the country in some ways. And so to have been a part of that and have been a witness to that, I felt like was a very rare opportunity. So a lot of policymakers have a lot of experience in Washington, are working on political campaigns. They certainly are well versed in the issues, in the various policy approaches that have been tried in the past and that maybe should be tried in the future. Fewer of them have experience out in the field where the implications of policy are playing out, and where you can actually see what the results of the decisions in Washington actually are in the world. The reason I wanted to get into policymaking was because after 4 or 5 years of writing about the implications of these Washington policy debates, I wondered whether that experience might help me help the government be able to make those decisions better. It turns out making those decisions is challenging. I had probably less sympathy than I should have for policymakers when I was a journalist. When you're on the other side of that divide, these things tend to be more complicated. That said, I really do think it was valuable to have had these experiences in the field, seeing how decisions play out when I went back to actually work on policy. And actually, the other area where it's quite helpful as a journalist was to have been able to interact with ordinary people in some of these places. As a government official, when you visit countries, you tend to meet with other government officials, or maybe you meet with journalists in another country, or business leaders. What you don't tend to do is have conversations with people who just live in these places, which is what a big part of what it is that the journalists do, and you get a very important, I think, perspective that way. Sure. So on the policymaking process, the State Department itself has two real roles. One is it has a seat at the table in what's called the interagency policy process. Now that means the policy decision making that is convened by the White House, by the National Security Council. They will bring all the departments and agencies into a room in the White House, usually part of the Situation Room, and there will be a discussion paper that's circulated in advance, and all the different departments and agencies will come in with their view as to which approach should be taken, which decision should be made. The State Department is a key player in those conversations at every level, up to the level of the cabinet, where the Secretary of State will actually be the representative at the table helping make those decisions. But the other part of the policy process is the State Department itself has to arrive at a position. It's a big institution. There are 70,000 people. There are bureaus that are focused on all kinds of topics like human rights, like terrorism, like the region involved in the decision, specifically, for example, the Middle East or South Asia. And those different parts of the State Department sometimes have different views. So one role that the Chief of Staff has is to bring the department together, have the debate internally, and then make a recommendation to the Secretary of State as to what the department's position should be. In the end, the final decision is made by my former boss, Secretary Kerry, in my case, by the Secretary, the person leading the organization. So it's early, right? I mean, we just marked 100 days into the Trump administration, and so I think it's one thing that I want to be clear about is that probably we should not make too many permanent judgments about where they are in their policy process this early on. That said, I do think there have been some signs of real difference, a different sort of approach, and some things that I think those of us who were involved in the previous administration find troubling. One big example is that there seem to be a lot of decisions made outside of the context of a formal process like I just described. Not in the Situation Room with all the departments and agencies around the table, but in smaller groups with fewer people, sometimes with people who are not national security experts, people who are more political in nature. So that's one thing I think that's troubled people, because some of these decisions have been made, and there's one a good example that's been written about, a raid that U.S. Special Forces conducted in Yemen, where not only was the Secretary of State or the State Department not involved in that conversation, but neither was the intelligence community. Normally the intelligence community is in these debates so they can tell people what is the latest intelligence on the situation that you're making a decision about. They were not involved in that decision on this Yemen raid. So that raised a lot of flags, I think, for people. The other thing that some people have made note of, and I think rightly so, was that the Trump administration added a purely political advisor, not a national security expert, Steve Bannon, to what is called the Principals Committee of the National Security Council. So right alongside the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, the CIA Director, Secretary of State, is someone whose background is not national security, but is frankly, politics. Now, they have corrected that. They have removed Mr. Bannon from the Principals Committee, which is, I think, a positive step. That said, I believe he still attends the meetings, even though he is not actually listed anymore in the memo that describes who is in these meetings. And then the third thing, which I think is actually in some ways to me, as a former State Department person, most troubling, is the new administration really does seem to value and prize military operations and military expertise over diplomacy in the making of foreign policy. Now, having had the experiences that I've had alongside the military, which I have a tremendous degree of respect for, I do think having military officers, civilians who work in the Pentagon involved in the policy process is critical. That said, there are some problems that cannot be addressed just by military action. That's where diplomacy, development, some of the other tools in our foreign policy toolbox come into play. And the new administration has signaled, because it is not empowering diplomats, it is threatening to cut dramatically the State Department's budget. It is moving aside some long-time career experts as opposed to incorporating them into these conversations, that it actually doesn't value diplomacy as much as some of us think it should. So this is an incredibly complicated time. I don't want to make the mistake that I think everybody makes when answering a question like this, to assume that whatever moment you're talking about is the most complicated moment that any policymakers have ever had to face. I think there are plenty of people who have been doing this line of work for a long time who would have examples of other very complicated points in American history. That said, there are some very real, very difficult crises that the new administration is facing, and I'll mention just two of them. One is Syria. Now, that is a crisis that has been festering for quite a long time now, 6 years plus on the international scene, one that the Obama administration wrestled with at every stage, and one that people who have really worked on foreign policy over a period of years or even decades have described as, in some ways, the most complicated, difficult to solve foreign policy problem that any of them have ever seen during the course of their careers. So one step that the new administration has taken that is a relatively change from the previous administration was they took military strikes against the Syrian government in response to the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons against its own people. Now, that, I think, was a step that some of us who served in the previous administration applauded and endorsed, but it will only really be a success if the new administration has a strategy for following up on that move, for taking advantage of the leverage that is created by taking a military strike like that to try to use diplomacy and other tools to try to end the war, and no evidence yet that they are doing that, but I hope they will. The second major crisis that I think is going to dominate a lot of the time that the new administration spends on foreign policy is obviously going to be North Korea. Now, here you have a very difficult situation. You have a country that is hostile to the United States. You have a leader whose intentions, decision-making, motives are very opaque and some would say erratic. We don't have direct diplomatic relations with North Korea, so we often speak to them through intermediaries like the Chinese. We don't have economic relations with North Korea, so our ability to use economic pressure is limited. We have to use economic pressure through other countries, again, like China, whose economic relationship is the most important that North Korea has. And you have a country that already has nuclear weapons, and frankly, is threatening, even if people don't believe that its genuine intent is to use them in the near term, but is threatening to do so. We also have very close allies who are in harm's way in this situation. You have South Korea right on North Korea's border, and you have Japan, which is in missile range of North Korea. So you add all that up, and it's a very complicated foreign policy problem. What the new administration is doing so far, I think, is a continuation of what the Obama administration did. Increase the pressure on North Korea through sanctions and through working with China, again, the main economic connectivity to North Korea, and then offer the prospect of diplomacy and negotiations, but only if North Korea starts to make certain changes, and don't use diplomacy as a reward for bad behavior. That is an approach that we thought makes sense, and it looks like the new administration is following that too. The one criticism I have of the new administration's approach on North Korea is a lot of erratic public statements that are sort of all over the map in terms of what the intentions are. Threatening the possibility of war 1 minute and then offering the possibility of diplomacy the next. If they are hard to interpret for someone like me who worked in the government in the United States, I can only imagine how difficult those statements are to interpret for a North Korean government that probably misunderstands us as much as we occasionally misunderstand them. And when there's misunderstanding about intentions, there can be miscalculation and really serious consequences if people aren't more careful.